The slap landed before anyone could process what was happening. 1 second, Nurse Mara Weston was standing in the middle of the emergency department hallway, arms at her sides, chin up. The next, hospital director Douglas Farrell's open palm connected with her face so hard the sound cracked off the tile walls like a gunshot. Her head snapped sideways. A tray of instruments hit the floor. The whole ER went silent, monitors still beeping, fluorescent lights still humming. But every human being in that corridor stopped breathing. No screaming, no rushing forward. No one moved. Mara steadied herself against the nurse's station counter, pressed her fingers to her cheek, and looked at Farrell with an expression nobody in that room could read. Not rage, not tears. Something older and harder than both. "Security," Farrell said, his voice completely level. "Get her out." She handed over her badge without a word. And the old man in the trauma bay, the one she had just dragged in from the rain, the one whose arm she had sewn shut with her own hands, watched all of it from behind a curtain. Then he reached for his phone and dialed. "If you've made it this far, I want you to stay until the very end, because this story is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. Hit like, hit follow, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." The storm had started around noon. Mara Weston had been on her feet since 6 in the morning, which was normal. 12-hour shifts at Callaway Memorial Hospital in the city of Drenthe were normal. Being the only nurse on the floor who showed up 15 minutes early every single day was normal. Getting passed over for the charge nurse position twice in 3 years, that was also apparently normal. She was 31 years old. She had a ponytail that was always slightly crooked by hour 4 of any shift. She drank her coffee cold because she never had time to drink it hot. She was quiet in the particular way that people mistake for meekness, which was a mistake that many people at Callaway Memorial had made about Mara Weston, and none of them had ever fully corrected it. She was refilling a supply cart near the ambulance bay doors when she first saw him. An old man, maybe mid-70s, standing in the parking lot in the rain. He was wearing a canvas jacket that was soaked through, holding his left arm against his side in a way that told her, even from 40 feet away, even through a rain-streaked glass door, that something was badly wrong with it. He wasn't stumbling. He wasn't calling for help. He was just standing there like a man who had learned a long time ago not to make demands of situations he couldn't control. Mara was already moving toward the door. "Hey!" Sandra Chu, the intake coordinator, looked up from her desk. "You can't go out there without—" But Mara was already outside. The rain was cold and immediate. She crossed the 30 feet in seconds, got a hand on the man's arm, and saw the blood then. It had soaked through his sleeve and was dripping off his elbow, running thin and pink in the rainwater pooling around his boots. "Sir, I've got you. Can you walk?" He looked at her with dark, steady eyes. "I can walk?" "Then walk with me. Right now." She got him through the ambulance bay doors. Sandra was standing with her mouth slightly open, clipboard in hand, looking at the blood trail on the tile like it was personally inconvenient. "We need a trauma bay," Mara said. "He hasn't been triaged. He's bleeding from a deep laceration on the left forearm, possibly into the muscle." "He needs a bay now, Sandra." "I understand that, but procedure requires—" "Sandra." Mara kept her voice flat. "Trauma Bay 2 is empty. You can see it from where you're standing." Sandra looked at the man, looked at the blood, looked at her clipboard. "I have to call intake." "Then call them from the bay." She moved the man herself, got him on the gurney, got a pressure dressing on the arm, got his vitals running. The laceration was deep. Something had opened his forearm from mid-wrist to elbow, a clean cut with ragged edges that had been bleeding long enough to soak through 2 layers of clothing. He needed cleaning, irrigation, suturing. He needed it now, not after a 20-minute intake process. "What's your name?" she asked, working. "Callum Voss." "Callum, I'm Mara. Can you tell me what happened?" "Took a fall outside, caught a rusted edge on the way down." His voice was even, unhurried, the kind of voice that had been in worse rooms than this and knew it. "Where were you coming from?" "VA office, 2 blocks over, appointment ran late." She noted that, filed it, kept working. She was halfway through cleaning the wound when Douglas Farrell appeared in the doorway. Farrell was 54 and built like a man who had been athletic 20 years ago and hadn't fully accepted the transition. He wore his administrator's badge on a lanyard and had the particular posture of someone who considered his presence in any room to be an arrival. He looked at Mara. He looked at the patient. He looked at the blood on the gurney and the pressure dressing and the supply tray she'd pulled without authorization. "Who approved this?" he said. Mara didn't look up. "He needed immediate care. Who approved this, Bay?" "I moved him here. He was bleeding." "You are not a physician, Nurse Weston. You do not authorize trauma bay usage. Where's the attending?" "Dr. Reyes is in Bay 4 with a cardiac case. Dr. Sumner is in Bay 1. She finally looked up. "Mr. Voss needed immediate attention. I provided it." Farrell stepped fully into the bay. His jaw was tight. "You pulled supplies without a physician order. You moved a patient without an intake assessment. You went outside the building and physically transported a civilian into this emergency department without authorization. He was going to bleed out in the parking lot. That is not your judgment to make." Callum Voss had been watching this quietly. His eyes moved from Farrell to Mara and back again, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it precisely behind his face. "His vitals are stable," Mara said. "The laceration is deep, but the bleeding's controlled. I've irrigated it. He needs suturing. 15 to 20 stitches, possibly more. I'd like to complete the care before we have this conversation." Farrell looked at her for a long moment. Something passed through his expression that wasn't administrative. It was something more personal and meaner. "Step outside, Nurse Weston. I'm in the middle of treating a patient. Step outside now." She set down her instruments carefully. She looked at Callum Voss, and something passed between them. Not words, just the specific acknowledgement of two people who have both spent time in situations where other people's poor decisions created dangerous conditions. "I'll be right back," she told him. She stepped into the hallway. Farrell followed, letting the curtain fall. The hallway was busy. Nurses moving between bays, a paramedic team pushing an empty gurney toward the bay doors, Sandra still at her desk looking studiously at her computer screen. All of them aware, none of them intervening. "You are consistently one of the most insubordinate staff members in this department," Farrell said. His voice was low and controlled, which was somehow worse than if he'd been shouting. "Every policy I implement, you find a way around. Every procedure, you override. You think compassion is a substitute for protocol. I think that man's arm needed to be cleaned and sutured, and that's what I was doing. You think your judgment supersedes this hospital's standards of care. I think he was bleeding in a parking lot. You went outside this building. Do you understand the liability? He was an elderly man with a serious laceration, standing alone in a rainstorm, and I was the closest medical professional. Yes, I went outside. I'd do it again." Farrell stared at her, and then he said something that made several nearby staff members look up from what they were doing. "Let me be clear about something. I have been looking for a reason to remove you from this department for 8 months. You are difficult, you are inconsistent with protocol, and you make this team uncomfortable with your constant need to be the one who swoops in and saves everyone. This is a hospital, not a heroics competition." Mara was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was very steady. "Is that a formal disciplinary notice?" "No," Farrell said. "It's a warning. Get back in there, finish what you started, since apparently we're committed now, and then report to my office when your shift ends." He turned away. She went back to Callum Voss. She sutured his arm with the kind of precise, economical technique that takes years to develop. Not the cautious, methodical stitching of someone working through a textbook, but the fast, confident work of someone who had done this before in conditions that didn't allow for caution or methodology. 22 sutures, clean closure. She dressed it while Callum watched her hands. "He's done that before," Callum said. "Done what?" "Talk to someone like that, like he was explaining something to them for the last time." Mara smoothed the tape down over the dressing. "Hold still." "You're good at this," he said. "It's my job." "That's not what I mean." She looked at him then. He was watching her with those steady dark eyes, and there was something in his expression that she didn't know what to do with. A kind of recognition that felt like it was coming from somewhere deeper than this room, This afternoon, this hospital. How long have you been a nurse? He asked. 7 years. Before that? She picked up the used instruments and set them on the disposal tray. Before that isn't relevant to your discharge paperwork, Mr. Voss. He smiled barely. Callum! She finished his documentation, printed his aftercare instructions, went over the signs of infection, the wound care protocol, when to seek follow-up. He listened to everything she said with the kind of attentiveness that made her feel, for a moment, that she was the one being assessed. When she handed him the paperwork, he took it and didn't look at it. He was still watching her. You should get someone to look at your hand, he said. She glanced down. She'd cut her palm slightly on the gurney rail at some point. She hadn't noticed. There was a thin red line across her left palm, already beginning to crust. She hadn't felt it. I will, she said. She wouldn't. There was no time for that. She left Bay 2 and went back to the floor, and for the next 2 hours she worked, a broken wrist from a construction accident, an allergic reaction in a 12-year-old, a chest pain call that turned out to be anxiety and a pulled muscle, an elderly woman with a UTI who had been sitting in the waiting room for 3 hours and was near tears. Mara moved through all of it with the same pace and the same expression, which was not the expression of someone who was performing competence, but of someone who simply was competent, which are very different things to watch. At 4:30, Sandra found her at the medication station. Mr. Voss is still here, Sandra said. He won't leave. Mara looked up. Is there a problem with his discharge? No, he's medically cleared. He just said he's waiting. Waiting for what? He wouldn't say. Mara went to the waiting area. Callum Voss was sitting in one of the plastic chairs near the window, his bandaged arm resting on his knee, watching the rain against the glass. He looked entirely comfortable, the way only certain people look in waiting rooms, people who have waited in worse places. You should go home, Mara said. You're discharged. I know. Then why are you still here? He looked at her sideways. Wanted to make sure you were all right. I'm fine. You're about to not be fine, he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. Something about the way he said it wasn't a threat and wasn't exactly a warning. It was closer to a statement of logistics, the way you might tell someone that the road ahead has construction, just information. Mr. Voss, Callum, she took a breath. Is there someone who can drive you home? The medication I gave you for pain will start to work in about 40 minutes, and you shouldn't. I already made a call, he said. Someone's coming. Good. Then you should wait outside, or... Mara. She stopped. Be careful with Farrell, he said. Men like that aren't careful when they feel cornered. She didn't know what to say to that. She went back to the floor. At 5:15, Douglas Farrell appeared in the main corridor of the emergency department. He was not heading to his office. He was moving with the particular purposefulness of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it, and he was heading directly toward Mara, who was standing at the nurse's station completing a chart. She saw him coming. She set the chart down. Nurse Weston? He stopped 6 feet away in the middle of the hallway where everyone could see, where everyone was already starting to look. I've made a decision regarding this afternoon's incident. I haven't yet been to your office, she said. My shift ends at... I'm not waiting for your shift to end, his voice carried, deliberately. Your actions today constituted a direct violation of patient intake policy, unauthorized use of hospital resources, unauthorized transport of an exterior patient, and a pattern of conduct that I have documented across the past 8 months. He paused. Effective immediately, your employment at Callaway Memorial is terminated. The corridor went quiet. There were at least 12 people who could hear this. 2 nurses at the station, 3 nurses in the nearby bays, an orderly, a paramedic waiting for handoff, a patient in a wheelchair waiting to be moved, Sandra, frozen at her desk. Mara looked at Farrell. I'd like to see the formal termination paperwork. It's being prepared. I'd like to see it before I hand over my badge. You'll hand over your badge now. I have rights to... You have whatever rights I decide to extend to you. His voice dropped 1 degree further, which was somehow worse. You have spent years believing that the rules in this building don't apply to you, that your instincts override policy, that your personal history, whatever it is you think makes you special, Gives you license to operate outside the standards that every other member of this staff adheres to. He stepped closer. Let me explain something. I run this department, not your instincts, not your history. Me. Mr. Farrell. Her voice was even. I am asking you to step back. He didn't step back. What he did, and no one who saw it would ever be completely sure, afterward, what had preceded it in his mind, what calculation or snap of control or simple unbridled contempt had led to it, was raise his right hand and bring it across Mara Weston's face. Open palm. Hard. The sound bounced off every tile in that corridor. Her head snapped sideways. She put one hand on the counter to steady herself. She didn't make a sound. The corridor did not erupt. There were no shouts, no rushing forward, no immediate intervention. What happened was a silence so total, it was almost physical. 12 people suddenly not breathing, the monitors still beeping behind it, the rain still hitting the windows, the fluorescent lights continuing their indifferent hum as though nothing had changed. Farrell straightened his jacket. Your badge, now. Mara Weston pressed 2 fingers against her cheekbone, lifted her eyes to his, and the expression on her face, still that thing that wasn't rage and wasn't tears, that older and harder thing, did not change. She unclipped her badge from her lanyard, set it on the counter without looking at it, picked up her bag from under the station, and walked steadily toward the exit. Nobody stopped her. Nobody said a word. From Trauma Bay 2, past the curtain he'd never fully left, Callum Voss watched her walk out. He watched Farrell straighten his tie. He watched the other nurses look at their shoes and their charts, and the middle distance, anywhere but at each other, because looking at each other would require acknowledging what they had just allowed to happen. Callum Voss reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He dialed a number from memory. It rang twice. "This is Voss," he said when the line connected. His voice was entirely calm. "I need a direct line to Commander Hatch." "Yes, that Hatch. Tell him it's about Weston. He'll know the name." A pause. "No, I'll hold." He stood up from his chair, phone pressed to his ear, and looked through the waiting room window at the parking lot below, where Mara Weston was walking out into the rain without an umbrella, without looking back, without breaking stride. Outside, the rain was coming down harder than it had been that morning. Mara walked across the parking lot with her bag over one shoulder and her hand still pressed against the side of her face. Not because it hurt badly enough to need pressure, but because the physical act of pressing her own palm against her own face was, at that moment, the only thing that felt solid. Everything else had gone strangely light, the way the world goes light after something happens that your body understood before your mind did. She had not let herself feel the slap while it was happening. She had not let herself feel the room. She had not let herself feel the row of faces watching her hand and her badge, like she was supposed to stand there and be grateful for the dignity of not being physically removed. Now, walking, she felt it. Not the sting, though that was there, hot and specific below her left eye. The other thing, the thing that came from standing in a hallway full of people who had watched her bleed for this place for 7 years, and not one of them had moved. She had been in a room once, a different kind of room, a long time ago, in a country whose name she did not let herself say out loud anymore, where the people around her had also not moved, where the situation had also been very bad and the outcome had also depended on what she did next. In that room she had moved. She had not waited for permission or authorization or the cavalry. She had moved and she had kept moving, and people had lived because of it. That room had been in her body ever since, not as trauma, or not only as trauma, but as instruction, as a kind of baseline certainty about what she was capable of that no one could file paperwork against. Douglas Farrell had not fired a nurse today. He didn't know what he had fired. She was at the edge of the parking lot where the hospital grounds gave way to the sidewalk and the street beyond when she heard it, distant at first, then rapidly not distant at all. The rhythmic, percussive sound of a helicopter, and not a medevac helicopter, not the distinctive white and orange of the Callaway Memorial Air Unit she'd seen dozens of times. This was something heavier, military. She stopped walking, tilted her head back, rain hitting her face. The helicopter came in low over the hospital's south wing, a dark utilitarian machine with no markings visible from the ground, and set down on the hospital's helipad with a precision that civilian pilots couldn't match, the rotors cutting the air at a specific angle that Mara recognized from years of standing under aircraft in much louder, much more dangerous circumstances. She stood in the rain and watched. Through the rain-streaked windows of the emergency department, she could see them from here, 3 stories of glass facing the parking lot. Shapes were moving, people going to windows, faces pressing against glass. Farrell appeared in the lobby doorway, silhouetted, looking out. A figure descended from the helicopter. Even from 200 feet away, even through the rain, Mara could read the way the figure moved, the specific economy of motion, the flat-footed precision, the particular way a person carries themselves when they have spent years operating in environments where hesitation gets people killed. Military. Special operations. Someone who outranked almost everyone in that building by a margin that paperwork couldn't measure. The figure crossed the helipad and entered the hospital through the roof access. Mara stood in the parking lot in the rain and waited, because somewhere in her chest, something that had been locked for a very long time had shifted. Not open, not yet, but loose in its casing. Rattling. Inside, she knew the emergency department was about to become a very different room than it had been 60 seconds ago. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A number she didn't recognize. Area code she did. She answered. Weston. The voice on the other end was familiar in the way that a city you grew up in is familiar. Not comfortable, not warm, but embedded. Part of the architecture of who you were. Don't leave. She stared at the rain hitting the pavement. Who authorized this? She said. Voss called it in. She closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. I don't need... That's not why I'm here, the voice said. Stay where you are. I'm coming down. The line went dead. Across the parking lot, through the glass lobby doors, she could see the shapes of nurses and orderlies and administrators moving in the kind of agitated cluster that forms when something has disrupted the normal hierarchy of a room, when someone has walked in who does not belong to any of the systems that usually organize things, and everyone is trying to figure out what that means. And at the nurses' station, visible even from here, Douglas Farrell was standing very still. The hand he had raised against her face 40 minutes ago was now hanging at his side. He wasn't moving. He was watching the elevator. Mara Weston put her phone in her pocket, straightened her bag on her shoulder, and stood in the rain, water running down the back of her neck, fingers against her bruised cheekbone, and waited for the elevator doors in that lobby to open. The elevator doors opened. Commander Dex Hatch stepped out into the lobby of Callaway Memorial wearing a uniform that had no business being in a civilian hospital, and he walked like a man who was completely aware of that fact and had decided it was everyone else's problem. He was 6'1", broad through the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been weather-beaten into something close to permanent neutrality. He scanned the lobby in the way that certain people scan rooms, not looking for threats exactly, but cataloging everything anyway, because the habit was older than the need. He saw Farrell first. Farrell was standing near the reception desk with 2 other administrators who had materialized in the last 10 minutes. Patricia Odom from HR, who had the look of a woman who had been dragged from a meeting she was already behind on, and the hospital's legal counsel, a thin man named Garrett Wolfe, who had arrived carrying a leather folio and wearing the expression of someone who had received a phone call they wished they hadn't. The 3 of them made a tableau of institutional self-protection, and Hatch read it in about 2 seconds. He didn't stop at the desk. He didn't introduce himself. He said to the room in general, "Where is she?" Farrell stepped forward. "I'm sorry, Commander. I'm not asking you," Hatch said, without heat, without aggression. "Just information." His eyes had already moved past Farrell to the nurses' station, where 2 nurses were standing very still, watching. One of them, a young woman with dark hair and a trauma shear still clipped to her scrub pocket, said quietly, "She went to the parking lot." "Thank you." He turned back toward the exit. "Commander?" Farrell's voice had a new quality in it now. Not the administrative authority he'd used with Mara, but something that wanted to sound like authority while quietly knowing it wasn't quite reaching. "I'd like to understand the nature of this visit. If there's a concern regarding one of our staff members, the appropriate channel would be..." Hatch stopped, turned. Looked at Farrell the way you look at a door that's slightly off its hinge, noticing it, calculating whether it needs dealing with right now or later. "We'll talk," Hatch said, "when I come back inside." He pushed through the lobby doors into the rain. Mara heard the doors before she saw him. She was standing at the edge of the parking lot where she'd been for the past 7 minutes, and she did not turn around immediately when she heard the footsteps, because there are certain moments when you need one more second before the thing you've been waiting for becomes real. Then she turned. Hatch crossed the distance between them without hurrying. He stopped 2 feet away, looked at the left side of her face where the bruise was coming up now, visible even in the gray rain light, a wash of red below her cheekbone that would be purple by morning. And his jaw moved once, the way a jaw moves when a person decides not to say the first thing that came to mind. "Weston," he said, "Commander." "You look like you've had a day." "I've had worse." "Yeah," he said. "You have." He looked at the building behind her. "Walk me through it." She did. Short, sequenced, no editorializing. The old man in the parking lot, the laceration, the intake coordinator, the unauthorized bay, Farrell's appearance, the termination, the hallway. She didn't describe how the slap had felt. She didn't tell him about the 12 people who'd watched and said nothing. He could infer those parts, and he would. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The rain came down between them. "Boss called you directly?" she said. "He did." "How does he know you?" "We served together. Different unit, same theater, 2009. Hatch paused. "He called me because he knew I'd know your name." "He shouldn't know my name." "A lot of people know your name, Weston. You know that." She looked away. "Not in Drenthe, they don't." "You've been here 4 years?" "Yes." 4 years in a civilian ER, running a nurse's salary and eating cold coffee. He said it without judgment, but without softening it either. Just the shape of it. "You could have gone back in. There were multiple offers." "I know." "You chose this." "I chose this," she confirmed. "Why?" She looked at him directly. "Because out there, I could keep people alive. In here, I can also keep people alive and nobody gets shot afterward." Something shifted behind Hatch's eyes. Not quite a smile, not close enough to be called that, but something that acknowledged that this answer was exactly specific enough to be honest. "Come back inside," he said. "I was just terminated." "Not by anyone with the authority to make it stick." He turned toward the building. "Come on, let's go see what kind of man Mr. Farrell is under pressure." What? The lobby had gained people. In the 8 minutes since Hatch had walked through it, word had moved through the building the way it always moves through hospitals. Faster than administration would prefer, slower than the people who needed to know would like. The lobby now contained, in addition to Farrell, Odom, and Wolf, 3 nurses who had come down from the floor on various pretexts, an ER attending named Dr. Priya Anand, who had technically finished her rounds and was therefore under no obligation to still be present, but was, and Sandra Chu, who was standing near the reception desk with her clipboard and had not once looked down at it in the past 15 minutes. When Mara walked back through the doors with Hatch behind her, the room adjusted. Not loudly. The way a room adjusts when something enters it that changes the pressure. Farrell looked at Mara, then at Hatch. Something in his face went through 2 or 3 calculations in quick succession, and none of them landed on anything comfortable. "Mr. Farrell," Hatch said, coming to stand in the center of the lobby, "I'm Commander Dex Hatch. I'm going to ask you to have your legal counsel present for this conversation." He glanced at Wolf, "Which it looks like you've already done, so that's helpful." Wolf opened his folio, clicked a pen, and said nothing. "This is a private personnel matter," Farrell said. "Whatever relationship you have with former staff, this hospital." "Former staff." Hatch said it back to him without inflection, the way you repeat something to make sure everyone in the room has fully heard it. "Ms. Weston's employment was terminated this afternoon following repeated policy violations and an incident that—" "I have 2 questions," Hatch said, "before we get into the incident. First question, are you aware that under federal statute, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act mandates stabilization and treatment of any individual in a medical crisis who presents on hospital grounds, including the exterior grounds, including parking areas?" regardless of insurance, registration, or intake completion? Farrell looked at Wolf. Wolf was writing something. Second question, Hatch continued, and his voice hadn't changed temperature at all. Do you want to explain to me why your security footage, which I've already requested under Federal Medical Oversight Authority and which I will be receiving whether or not you cooperate with that request, is going to show a hospital director striking a nurse in the face in front of witnesses? The lobby was very quiet. That footage, Farrell said, and his voice was careful now. The way a person is careful when they realize the ground under their feet is not what they thought it was. Will show it will show assault, Hatch said. In a workplace. On camera. In front of witnesses. Some of whom are standing in this room. He let that sit for exactly 1 second. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a military commander with a federal mandate and a strong interest in the welfare of one of my people. But I have lawyers, and they are both more thorough and significantly less patient than I am. Garrett Wolf had stopped writing and was looking at Farrell with the expression of a man who is revising his hourly rate. She is not your... Farrell started. I didn't say she was currently active. I said she was mine. Hatch's voice dropped 1 degree, which somehow made it carry further. There's a difference. Look it up. Patricia Odom from HR said quietly. Douglas. It was a one-word sentence that meant several things at once, and Farrell heard all of them. He stopped talking. Dr. Anand from near the elevator said, not loudly, just clearly, she saved that patient's life. The one in Bay 2. She was the only one who moved. Nobody told her to be quiet. Nobody agreed with her out loud either. But something shifted slightly in the room's arrangement. Invisible, like furniture that has moved an inch and changed the way sound travels. Farrell looked at Mara. The specific way a man looks at someone when he is trying to recalculate their dimensions and finding that his previous measurements were badly wrong. Mara said nothing. She stood with her bag on her shoulder and her bruised cheek in her cold, still hands, and she looked back at him without any particular expression. She had stood in front of more frightening things than Douglas Farrell. She had stood in front of them in much worse condition. The trick she had learned a long time ago was not to confuse presence with power. My counsel will need to review any formal requests, Farrell said, finally, to Hatch, and the quality of his voice had changed. It was the voice of someone who has decided that managing the situation is now more important than winning it. Of course, Hatch said pleasantly. In the meantime, I'm going to ask that Ms. Weston be provided a space in this building to wait while I make some calls. Given that she has not yet received written termination documentation, her access to this facility remains current. He looked at Odom. That is correct, isn't it? No written documentation? No formal separation? Odom looked at her clipboard. That's correct. Wonderful. He turned to Mara. You know where the family consultation room is? She nodded. Go wait. I'll find you in 20 minutes. She went. Note. The family consultation room on the first floor was a small, neutral-colored space with a round table and 4 chairs and a box of tissues on the windowsill that had never, in Mara's experience, been replaced when it ran out. She sat in the chair facing the door, put her bag on the table, and did not touch the tissues. She had been in this room before, not as a waiting family member. Nurses rarely ended up on that side of things, but twice, briefly, to use it as a quiet space between codes when the ER had been running too hot and she'd needed 60 seconds of sealing. It was the kind of room that absorbed difficult news, the walls slightly softened by years of it. She sat there now and let herself carefully go through the afternoon. Not the feelings, the facts, the sequence. The old man in the parking lot, who had not seemed like an old man in the ordinary sense of that phrase from the moment she'd looked at him. He had seemed like someone who was old the way certain buildings are old, not worn down, but denser, more compressed, with more inside them than the exterior suggests. The wound, the suturing, Farrell in the doorway, the hallway, the slap. She let herself feel that for 1 full second, the flat, cracking physicality of it, the specific quality of shock that is not about pain, but about the sudden confirmation that someone has decided you are the kind of person that can be struck, and then she set it aside. The helicopter. The number she didn't have saved. Hatch. She hadn't seen Dex Hatch in 4 years, which meant she had last seen him during the debrief process in the 6 months before she'd separated from service. He had been a lieutenant commander then. The promotion made sense. Everything about Hatch suggested a person who moved forward in straight lines. She pressed her fingers against the bruise under her eye and thought about Callum Voss. You thought nobody would remember. She hadn't thought that exactly. She had chosen to believe that the distance was enough. 4 years in a civilian setting in a mid-sized city that had no military installation within 50 miles. A quiet life organized around 12-hour shifts and takeout containers, and the one yoga class she went to on Sundays that she had never once mentioned to a coworker. She had not been hiding. She had been resting. There was a difference. Apparently the difference was not as clean as she'd thought. The door opened. It wasn't Hatch. It was Sandra Chu. Sandra came in and closed the door behind her and stood there for a moment looking at Mara with an expression that was doing a lot of work, guilt, and something adjacent to an apology, and underneath both of those, a kind of assessment, like she was seeing Mara differently than she had 4 hours ago and wasn't sure what to do with the new picture. "I brought you water," Sandra said. She was holding a plastic cup. "Thanks." Sandra set it on the table and then, because there was nothing else available to do with her hands, put them in her scrub pockets. She sat in the chair across from Mara without being invited, which was unusual, because Sandra Chu had spent 3 years at Callaway Memorial, being scrupulously appropriate about boundaries. "I didn't call anyone," Sandra said. "When you went outside, when you brought him in. I know I should have backed you up, and I didn't call anyone." Mara looked at her. "You were following protocol." "I was following protocol because I was scared of him," Sandra said, and the directness of it seemed to surprise her slightly, like she hadn't decided to say it out loud until it was already out. "That's not the same thing. I've been scared of him for 2 years and I've been calling it protocol." There was a silence. "It's not a small thing," Mara said finally, "being afraid of someone with authority over your livelihood." "You weren't afraid of him." "I've been afraid of worse things." She said it without drama, just true. Sandra looked at the table. "That man, Voss. What's his... Do you know him?" "I didn't, until today." "But the military, they..." Sandra gestured vaguely in the direction of the lobby. "That commander, he came because of you?" "He came because Voss called him. Because of what Farrell did. Because of all of it," Mara said. "I think..." Sandra was quiet for a moment, her fingers pressed together in her lap. "A lot of people knew it was wrong," she said, "what he did in the hallway. A lot of people, we saw it and we just..." She stopped. "I just want you to know that." Mara took a breath. "I know. I know that's not enough." "It's something," Mara said, and she meant it. Not generously, not forgivingly, but accurately. It was something. It wasn't enough. And it was also something, and both of those things could be true at the same time. Sandra stood up. Looked like she had more to say and decided correctly that she had said enough. She went to the door, then stopped. "Tasha Orimoto was going to say something," Sandra said. "She was right next to you. She opened her mouth and then she didn't." A pause. "I saw her face. I think she's going to have a hard time with that." Mara didn't say anything. Sandra left. Mara sat with the cup of water and the quiet and the slight throbbing under her eye and thought about a hallway in Drenthe, the specific weight of 12 people's silence, and a much older hallway in a different part of the world where the silence had also been specific and heavy, and where she had also been the only person who moved. She was 31 years old. She had been in this situation, in one form or another, more times than she should have been. She was tired, she realized. Not from the shift, from the specific tiredness of being the person who moves when other people don't. Hatch knocked once and came in without waiting. He sat down across from her and put a phone on the table between them. It was showing a text thread. She didn't read it. He looked at her face for a moment, assessing, and then leaned back in the chair with the easy posture of someone who has learned to rest in whatever surface is available. "The board chair is named Harriet Mace," he said. "She's been unreachable for the past 2 hours. That is now changing. What have you told them? I told the vice chair that I have credible reports of a federal EMTALA violation, a workplace assault on camera, and a pattern of patient care interference. I told him I have the authority to initiate a federal review of the facility's emergency department. He paused. I also told him that if the board would like to get ahead of this, the window for doing so is significantly smaller than it was an hour ago. Mara looked at the phone. You're moving fast. I'm moving appropriately. He looked at her. You want to tell me why you went 4 years without checking in? I checked in. You sent 3 emails in 4 years. One was a change of address notification. I was adjusting. To what? She looked at him. To everything not trying to kill me. He absorbed that. And is it? Adjusted? I was adjusting. She touched her cheek. Today set it back some. He almost smiled. There it is. He pulled the phone toward himself. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen to it without deciding in advance how you feel about it. That's a concerning opening. Voss has been watching this hospital for 8 months. She went still. Not specifically, Hatch said. Not you, specifically. He does this. It's a thing he does. Has done since he retired. He tracks VA-adjacent civilian facilities in multiple cities. Looks at patient complaint patterns, discharge irregularities, care denial trends. He runs it through a network of other retired operators who have nothing better to do and too much analytical training to turn off. He said this with a kind of fond exasperation. In this hospital, in this ER, he found something. Mara was very still now. What kind of something? A pattern of care denial, specific to patients presenting from the East Side zip codes, which, in Drenthe, means lower income, uninsured or underinsured, longer wait times, higher redirect rates, more frequent documentation of patients being counseled to seek care elsewhere. He paused. It started about 18 months ago, correlates with Farrell's installation as director. The consultation room felt smaller than it had 60 seconds ago. He's been turning patients away, she said. Systematically, not loudly. The kind of systematic that looks like administrative efficiency unless you're looking at the shape of it over time. Hatch looked at her directly. Voss was already building a file. Today accelerated the timeline. He wasn't just waiting for a ride, Mara said. He came here specifically. He came because he wanted to see the department from the inside. The laceration was real. He's not that committed to methodology. But the timing was deliberate. He needed to see how a presenting patient was handled. See who moved and who didn't. Hatch's voice was level. He didn't expect Farrell to do what he did. Nobody expected that. Mara was quiet for a moment. Something was reorganizing itself inside her. Not quite anger, not quite something else. The particular sensation of a thing you suspected becoming a thing you know. The patients he turned away, she said. Was anyone... 3 documented cases where a redirected patient subsequently deteriorated and required emergency intervention elsewhere. 1 death 9 months ago. 63-year-old man, cardiac event, sent home with antacids. Died 14 hours later. Hatch's voice didn't change. That one's in the file. Mara pressed her palm flat against the table. Breathed. Okay, she said. Okay? What do you need from me? Hatch looked at her for a moment, Shad. Not assessing, just looking the way people sometimes look at things they have known for a long time and are seeing clearly for the first time in a while. Right now, nothing. Right now, I need you to stay in this building, stay visible, and not do anything that gives Farrell's legal team a different story to tell. And after right now, we'll see what the board chair says. He stood up, looked down at her. Your file is good, Weston. For what it's worth? My personnel file or your other file, the one that doesn't have a 3-year gap in it. She looked up at him. There's no gap. I was working. I know, he said. That's why the file is good. He went to the door, then stopped, because people had apparently decided today was a day for stopping in doorways. Voss asked about you, he said, on the call. He said to tell you. He paused, looking faintly like a man who had been asked to deliver a message he thought was slightly unnecessary. He's said to tell you that you stitch better left-handed than most surgeons do with two. Something moved across Mara's face that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. He wasn't supposed to be watching that closely, she said. Old habits, Hatch said, and left. Chat. The next hour and 40 minutes were a specific kind of waiting. Mara had been good at waiting once. You had to be in the service. It was one of the non-negotiable skills. The ability to compress yourself into whatever time you had before the next thing happened and rest there without spinning out. She had lost some of that in civilian life, where the waiting was different, less purposeful, more the kind that accretes into anxiety. But today, in this room, she found it again. She could hear the building around her, the ER sounds, monitors, gurneys, the specific rhythm of a shift running, a code called on the second floor, the responding team's feet on the stairs, someone crying, briefly, in the family waiting room next door, the muted sound of Hatch's voice somewhere down the corridor, calm and persistent, the verbal equivalent of water finding its level. At some point, she estimated an hour in, the footsteps in the corridor outside the consultation room became more frequent. And then, at 6:52 by the clock on the wall, she heard something she hadn't expected. Multiple voices. Arriving. Not staff. The cadence was different. She went to the door, opened it a few inches. In the main corridor, heading toward the administrative wing, were 4 people she didn't recognize. 2 of them in suits, one in a different kind of uniform, one in plain clothes carrying a serious-looking camera rig. Behind them, Hatch. Beside Hatch, a woman who moved with the specific energy of someone who is driven fast from somewhere and is not slowing down. Mid-50s, silver-streaked hair, phone in one hand, expression like a person who has been waiting for a reason to do something for a very long time and has finally received it. That would be Harriet Mace, the board chair. Hatch caught Mara's eye through the gap in the door. He gave her a single nod that meant, "Stay where you are. I have this." She went back to her chair. 35 minutes later, the sound of the building changed again. She heard it before she understood it. A particular quality of movement, of multiple people relocating, of doors opening onto a different arrangement of things. And then she heard, from somewhere in the administrative wing above, a voice she recognized as Farrell's saying something she couldn't make out, and then a longer silence, and then nothing. The nothing lasted 11 minutes. Then Hatch opened the consultation room door and came in, and this time he was not alone. Behind him was a man Mara hadn't seen in 4 years, white-haired now where he'd been gray, moving more slowly, wearing a jacket over a hospital gown that meant he'd managed to locate the jacket from somewhere, which was very like him. He had 22 new stitches on his left forearm and a look on his face that was a very specific variety of satisfaction, the kind that is not about winning, but about the completion of something. "I told him to stay in the bay," Hatch said, and his tone made clear that this had always been a losing battle. Callum Voss looked at Mara. "Farrell just handed his badge to a federal compliance officer," he said. "About 4 minutes ago. The board suspended him pending investigation. They've already been on the phone with the state medical board." He settled into the chair across from her with the careful movement of someone managing a newly sutured arm and sat back. "There's a camera crew in the lobby. They're from the Regional Investigative Unit that's been covering the patient care story for the past 6 months. Harriet Mace just gave them a statement." Mara looked at him. "You knew about the care denial pattern," she said. "Yes." "You've been building a case." "Others have been building a case. I provided supporting information." "You came here today to—" "I needed to see the inside of this emergency department under normal operating conditions," he said. "I didn't plan on the laceration, but I won't pretend it wasn't useful." He met her eyes directly, unapologetically. "I also didn't plan on Farrell. That was—" a pause. "That was not something I was going to allow to stand." "You called Hatch because of the slap." "I called Hatch because of everything," Voss said. "The slap was the last thing." There was a silence in the room that was heavy, but not unpleasant. "You said you made a call," Mara said. "Right after, in the trauma bay. You said someone was coming. You didn't know Hatch would be the one." "I knew someone would come," Voss said simply. "When you say the right name to the right people, someone comes." She studied him. What name did you say? He looked back at her. And then, the thing about Callum Voss she was beginning to understand was that he spoke the way he had everything else, with the particular economy of a person who has been careful with words for a long time and will not waste them on softening something that doesn't need to be soft. I said Weston, he said. I said she was here, and she'd just been assaulted, and I needed someone who knew what that meant. He paused. It took about 6 seconds. Mara was quiet. Hatch was watching her with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who knows when not to be in a conversation. Outside the consultation room, the hospital was still moving, still beeping, still running, the ER still eating the city's emergencies and turning them into paperwork and outcomes, the way it always did. But something in the arrangement of the building had changed. The weight had shifted. Things that had been fixed were now in motion, and things that had been in motion were settling, slowly, into new shapes. Mara pressed her hand flat on the table. She thought about the 63-year-old man who had gone home with antacids and not woken up. She thought about all the people in the East Side zip codes who had come to this building in the past 18 months and been redirected, quietly, efficiently, into whatever came next without Callaway Memorial's help. She thought about 12 people in a hallway and the specific shape of their silence. "There's a patient upstairs," she said. Both men looked at her. "The woman in Bay 7, Ruth Alarcon. She came in with her daughter this afternoon during the shift change, and she's been waiting for a pulmonology consult for 4 hours. The consult was filed and—" She stopped. "I need to check if it was actually submitted or just documented as submitted." Hatch and Voss looked at each other. "I'm not currently an employee of this hospital," she said. "You're currently in an unresolved employment status," Hatch said, "which means you have not yet been formally separated and your clinical credentials remain active." Mara stood up, put her bag over her shoulder. "Then I'm going to go check on Mrs. Alarcon." Weston. Hatch's voice had a quality in it she recognized. Not a warning, exactly, but something adjacent. The sound of a man making a calculation about whether to say the next thing. She looked at him. "The camera crew," he said. "They're going to want a statement. Tonight, probably. The story they're running, it covers systemic care denial, but Mace gave them your situation specifically, the termination, the assault. You're in the story now, whether or not you—" "I'll deal with that when I'm done with Mrs. Alarcon," she said. She opened the door. The corridor outside had the specific quality of a space where something has just happened and people are still figuring out where to put it. 2 nurses she recognized from the floor were standing near the elevator. Tasha Orimoto was one of them, and she looked up when Mara came out, and her face did something complicated and honest that she clearly had not prepared in advance. Mara looked at her for a moment. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to, and it wasn't the moment for it. She just went toward the elevator because there was a patient upstairs who had been waiting 4 hours, and the paperwork trail on her consult needed to be checked, and that was the actual present situation regardless of everything else. She was in the elevator with her hand on the second-floor button when her phone went off. She looked at it. A number she didn't recognize, different area code than Hatch's, different format entirely. The kind of number that originates from a building with a federal address. She let the doors close, let the elevator begin to move. She answered it. "Weston." The voice on the other end was not Hatch. It was not anyone she knew. It was a woman's voice, precise and unhurried, with the quality of someone who has made an enormous number of important phone calls and long since stopped finding them remarkable. "Ms. Weston," the voice said, "my name is Colonel Adrian Farlow. I'm with the Inspector General's office, Joint Medical Command. We've been monitoring a situation at your facility for the past several months." A pause, barely perceptible. "We need to talk about the full extent of what's been happening at Callaway Memorial, and we need to talk about you specifically." The elevator reached the second floor. The doors opened. Mara stood there with her phone pressed to her ear and the corridor in front of her and the sound of a hospital running, and she said, "How long have you been watching this facility?" And the voice on the other end said, very carefully, "Long enough that what happened today was not a coincidence." Mara stepped off the elevator and kept her voice low. "How long?" she said again. 14 months, Colonel Farlow said. We opened the file after the first death. Armand Tesaro, 63, October of last year. His daughter filed a complaint with the state medical board that was partially substantiated but inconclusive. We picked it up from there. A brief pause. The pattern held, we've documented 11 cases of what we believe are deliberate care diversions under Farrell's direction. Patients from specific zip codes, specific insurance categories. 3 of those cases resulted in serious deterioration, 1 fatality. Mara was walking now, moving down the second-floor corridor toward the nursing station. She kept her pace even and her voice down because she was still in a working hospital, and the patients in the room she was passing had nothing to do with this conversation. You had 14 months of documentation, she said. What were you waiting for? Chain of evidence. We needed the financial records to complete the picture. Farrell was receiving supplemental compensation through a third-party billing contractor with ties to 2 private urgent care clinics operating in the same service area. We believed the diversions were generating referral revenue to those clinics, which he had undisclosed financial interest in. Farlow's voice was precise and unhurried. The financial subpoena cleared 2 days ago. We were 2 weeks from a formal filing, and today accelerated that. Today gave us something we didn't have: on-site witnesses, contemporaneous documentation, and an assault on a former service member that creates a separate federal nexus. A pause. Which is why I'm calling you directly. Mara reached the nursing station. The floor nurse on duty, a heavy-set man named Clarence who had worked the second floor for years and was unflappable in the way that only long-tenured hospital staff can be, looked up at her with an expression that said he had heard approximately everything and was still recalibrating. She held up one finger. He nodded. "What do you need from me?" she said into the phone. "A formal statement, on record, covering the events of today and your professional assessment of the care environment in that ER over the duration of your employment. We also need access to any informal documentation you kept. Incident logs, personal notes, anything." "I kept notes." There was a fractional pause. "You kept notes." 7 years of shift observations. "I log anything clinically irregular. Dates, patient presentations, outcomes when I could track them, staff responses." She had kept them on her personal laptop, formatted as simple text files with date stamps, the habit of someone trained to document everything, because in certain environments, the documentation outlives the people. "I kept them because I noticed the pattern. I just didn't know what it connected to." Colonel Farlow was quiet for 2 seconds. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, still precise, but with something underneath it that might have been the closest she got to relief. "Ms. Weston, I need those files tonight. I can have them to you in 2 hours. I'll send you a secure upload link." Another pause. "There's something else. The IG filing will be public within 72 hours. We can't contain it past the board notification, and the news unit in your lobby has already made calls. When this breaks, you will be the central figure in the public narrative. Not Farrell, not the financial fraud, not the board. You, the nurse who was assaulted and terminated for saving a patient." Farlow's tone was not unkind, but it was not soft either. "I want to make sure you understand that before it happens." Mara looked at the wall, at the corridor, at the ordinary ongoing fact of the hospital around her. Call lights and IV pumps and the smell of antiseptic and warmed-over cafeteria food. "I understand," she said. "Do you have legal representation?" "I will in the morning." "Good. One more thing." Farlow hesitated, fractionally, barely, but Mara caught it. "Your service record was accessed as part of our background review on key witnesses. Standard procedure." A pause. "I want you to know that everyone in my office who read it agrees that what happened in the Bravo Valley was one of the most extraordinary pieces of field medicine we've seen documented at that level." Mara said nothing. "That's all," Farlow said. "I'll send the link. Thank you for your time, Ms. Weston." The line ended. Mara stood at the nursing station for a moment with her phone in her hand and the specific sensation of a thing she had spent 4 years keeping in a locked drawer being opened in a room she had not chosen. She put the phone in her pocket. "Mrs. Alarcon," she said to Clarence, "Bay 7, pulmonology consult filed at 1400 hours. What's the status?" Clarence's face shifted. "It was filed. but the consult physician signed out at 15:30. His coverage doc was supposed to pick it up. Was that documented? It was documented as transferred. He pulled up the screen, looked at it. There's no acknowledgement from coverage, meaning she's been waiting 4 hours for a consult that nobody has actually accepted. Clarence didn't answer because the answer was in his face. Mara went to Bay 7. Ruth Alarcon was 68 years old and had come in that afternoon with her daughter, a woman in her 30s named Delia, who had the permanently tired eyes of someone who has been managing a parent's medical situation for longer than anyone prepared her for. Ruth had a chronic respiratory condition and had been experiencing increased shortness of breath over 2 days. The kind of escalation that wasn't immediately catastrophic but needed to be evaluated, and evaluated by someone who knew what they were looking at. She had been waiting 4 hours with an oxygen cannula and a TV remote, and her daughter sitting in the corner chair trying not to look frightened. Mara introduced herself, checked Ruth's chart. Her oxygen saturation was holding at 92, which was acceptable but not comfortable for someone with her baseline. Her breathing was slightly labored, not critically, but the kind of labor that gets worse with extended waiting and hospital-grade anxiety. "Nobody's told us anything in 2 hours," Delia said. Not accusatory, just exhausted. "We don't know if we're staying. We don't know if she needs anything changed. Nobody's been in." "I know," Mara said. "I'm sorry about the wait. I'm going to find out what's happening with the consult, and I'll come back and tell you directly." "Are you the doctor?" "I'm a nurse, but I'm going to get you an answer." She went back to the station, got Dr. Anand on the phone. Anand was still in the building, she knew. She'd seen her in the lobby, and explained the situation in 40 words. Anand said she'd be up in 10 minutes. Mara went back to Base 7 and told Delia that a physician would be there shortly and gave her the actual name and actual time, because specific information is one of the things nurses can give patients in situations where medicine is moving slowly, and it costs nothing and matters more than most people realize. Then she went back to the nursing station and stood there for a moment, and the full weight of the day settled onto her shoulders in a way it hadn't been able to while she was moving. She was 31 years old. She was a combat-trained medic with a classified service record and 7 years of emergency nursing and notes on 11 months of systematic patient harm logged on her personal laptop, and she had been slapped in a hospital hallway in front of 12 people who had looked away. She thought about Farrell handing over his badge. She thought about Harriet Mace arriving with the specific energy of a person who has been waiting for a reason. She thought about Callum Voss in the consultation room, sitting with his sutured arm and his contained satisfaction in his years of watching. She thought about Armand Tessaro, 63, who had gone home with antacids and not woken up, who had come to this building, this ER, and been redirected, who had a daughter who had filed a complaint that had been partially substantiated and inconclusive, who had not been saved because nobody moved. She became aware gradually that Clarence was looking at her. "You should go home," he said. "Get some sleep." "I'm waiting for the consult to land." "I'll watch it." "Clarence? I have been watching this floor for 11 years, he said. "I know how to watch a consult land." He looked at her squarely, in the way of someone who has decided to say the thing. "You've been fighting this building since you walked in the door this morning. You're allowed to stop for tonight." Mara looked at him. "The cameras are still in the lobby," she said. "I know. Hatch is going to want me to say something on record before I leave." "I know that too." She stood there for another moment, and the thing about being still, really still, in a hospital, after the kind of day this had been, was that it gave the fear room to arrive. Not the fear of Farrell, or the lawsuit, or the cameras, or the federal filing, or even the open drawer of her service record. A different fear, older and quieter and more personal. The fear that all of this had happened because of her, and all of this was going to continue happening because of her, and the particular life she had built in this city. The cold coffee, and the crooked ponytail, and the Sunday yoga class nobody knew about, was already over. Had already ended in that hallway at 5:15 that afternoon, and everything since was just the new thing beginning whether she was ready for it or not. She went to the elevator. She pressed the button for the lobby. The doors were just closing when her phone buzzed again. She looked at it, expecting the secure upload link from Colonel Farlow. It wasn't. It was a text from a number she didn't have saved. The message was 4 words long.
They found the contractor. She stared at it.
Before she could respond, the elevator stopped. Not at the lobby, but at the first floor, one level above, because the doors opened and Hatch was standing there, and his face had a quality she had not seen on it in the entire time she'd known him. It was not relief. It was not satisfaction. It was the expression of a man who has just received information that makes the situation significantly larger than it was a minute ago. "Get off the elevator," he said. "What happened?" "The contractor Farrell was working with." He held the doors. "They pulled the ownership structure an hour ago. There are 3 shell companies between the surface layer and the actual beneficial owner." He looked at her directly. "One of them traces back to a name on a federal procurement watch list. This isn't just a care diversion scheme for referral revenue. The billing fraud goes significantly deeper, and it connects to at least 2 other hospital systems in the region." Mara stepped off the elevator.
"How many facilities?" she said. "We don't know yet." His jaw was tight. "But Weston, your notes, the ones you told Farlow about, if your documentation covers what I think it covers everything I observed," she said. "Every irregular discharge, every redirected patient, every case where the documented decision didn't match the clinical picture." He looked at her for a moment, and there was something behind his expression she couldn't fully read. "There's a federal prosecutor in the administrative conference room," he said. "He's been here for the last 20 minutes. He specifically asked to speak to you before anyone else." A pause. "He said he has a second file, not the billing file. A different one." Hatch's voice was level, but barely. "He said you're in it." "You're in it," Hatch had said, and those 3 words had a specific weight that Mara was still measuring as she walked down the first-floor corridor toward the administrative wing. She'd been in files before. Service files, debrief files, the kind of classified documentation that existed in rooms she would never be allowed to enter and described things she had done in language she would not have chosen. That was different. That was the record of who she had been in a context that had rules she understood. This was something else. The administrative conference room was at the end of the wing, past the offices that would be dark and locked at this hour on any normal evening. Tonight the lights were on throughout. Mara could hear the particular hum of people working. Keyboards, low voices, the sound of documents being moved. The door to the conference room was closed. Hatch knocked once and opened it. The man inside was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s at the outside, with the lean, slightly insomniac look of someone who spent more time in front of documents than anywhere else. He was in a dark suit with his tie loosened by about 2 inches, which was the degree of loosening that said long day but not yet done. There were 3 folders on the table in front of him and a laptop open to something he closed when they came in. "Ms. Weston." He stood. "I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Del Rey. Thank you for coming in." "I didn't have far to go," she said. He almost smiled at that. He gestured to the chairs across from him, and they sat, she and Hatch both, which she noted he didn't object to. "I'll be direct," Del Rey said. "The billing fraud case against Farrell and the contractor network has been building for 8 months out of the federal district office. The financial piece is solid, but 3 weeks ago we received information suggesting the scheme extended beyond Callaway Memorial, that the same contractor structure, operating under different entity names, has relationships with 2 other regional hospital systems." He folded his hands on the table. "We've been trying to identify a nexus witness, someone with direct clinical observations across enough of the pattern to establish that the financial decisions were translating into actual care decisions at the ground level. Not just redirects, not just wait times, actual deliberate withholding of emergency treatment." "The patients," Mara said. "The patients, specifically the ones whose cases your notes cover." He looked at her directly. "Colonel Farlow tells me you have 7 years of shift observations. Personal logs, not hospital records." "That's right. If those logs document what she indicated, dates, presentations, irregular discharge decisions, outcome tracking, that's corroborating evidence across a time frame that predates the financial trail by 3 years. He paused. "That is significant, Ms. Weston. That closes a gap we could not otherwise close." Mara looked at the folders. "What's the second file?" Del Rey's expression didn't shift, but something behind it recalibrated. "I want to come back to that." "I'd rather you came to it now." He looked at her for a moment.
Then at Hatch, who said nothing and did not look away, which was Hatch's version of a statement. Delray opened the folder on his right. He turned it to face her. It was a photograph. Security camera footage, still frame printed. A man she didn't recognize, heavy set, late 50s, civilian clothes, entering what appeared to be a hospital loading dock. The timestamp in the corner was 14 months ago. His name is Roland Pruitt, Delray said. He's the beneficial owner at the center of the contractor shell structure. He has a federal procurement fraud conviction from 2014, which is why his name is on the watch list. He paused. He also has a prior relationship with this hospital that predates Farrell by 6 years. He was involved in a facilities contract that was terminated under irregular circumstances. The termination was handled internally, no public record, and the person who approved the termination and kept it off the formal disciplinary record was the previous hospital director. He let that land. Who retired 18 months ago, immediately before Farrell was appointed. The conference room was quiet. Pruitt came back when the new director was installed, Mara said. We believe Farrell was Pruitt's placement, that the directorship was effectively arranged, through board relationships we're still mapping, to give Pruitt re-entry into the hospital's billing infrastructure. Delray's voice was even and careful. This is not a hospital director who got greedy. This is a hospital director who was installed for a purpose, and the purpose was revenue extraction through a mechanism that required patient harm. Mara looked at the photograph for a long moment. The man in the image was walking with the comfortable stride of someone who belonged somewhere, who knew the door codes, knew the dock schedule, knew that nobody was going to ask him what he was doing there because somebody had already made sure of that. The second file, she said again. Delray closed the first folder, opened the one in the center. Pruitt's network has been operating in this region for 11 years, he said. Before the hospital systems, before the billing contractor structure, he was involved in a series of fraudulent procurement contracts with military medical supply chains, base contracts, forward deployment medical logistics. He looked at her. During an audit of those contracts in 2019, 2 supply chain irregularities were flagged at a forward operating base. The irregularities indicated that certain medical supplies, specific medications, specific volumes, were being diverted. Not stolen, exactly. Substituted. Degraded product moving through the legitimate supply chain under legitimate documentation. The room had changed temperature. Mara was not moving. The audit findings were classified, Delray said. The investigation was handed to military IG and never fully resolved. It was closed due to insufficient evidence. He paused. But there were field reports attached to the audit file, from medical personnel at the affected base who documented patient outcomes they couldn't explain by standard clinical means, outcomes that were inconsistent with the care provided. He turned the folder fully toward her. One of those reports was filed by a combat medic whose unit rotated through that base in late 2019. She did not look at the folder. She looked at Delray. You already know whose report it is, she said. Yes. And you're telling me this because Pruitt knows it exists, Delray said. His attorney made an inquiry to the IG's office last week about the classified audit file, specifically about the attached field reports, specifically about the one filed by the medic from the rotating unit. He looked at her steadily. He's been trying to access it for 8 months, since around the time the billing investigation started getting traction, Hatch said, very quietly. He's trying to find out what she documented. Yes, Delray said, and whether she's still findable. Yes. Mara sat with this for a moment. The conference room, the late evening, the sound of the building running around them, the bruise under her eye, the 7 years of shift logs on her laptop at home, the photograph of a man she had never met walking through a loading dock 14 months ago. He knows I'm here, she said. Not a question. He knows you work here. Whether he's connected today's events to the audit file, we don't know yet. Delray's voice was careful. But we'd prefer to know before he does. Quote, what happened next happened in pieces, the way consequential things usually do. Not in one dramatic motion, but in a series of smaller ones that accumulate until they've added up to something irreversible. Mara went home at 9:15. Not because the situation was resolved, but because Delray told her directly that the most useful thing she could do in the next 12 hours was upload her shift logs through the secure link Farlow had sent and get 3 hours of sleep, in that order. Hatch walked her out. Voss was still in the building. She had no idea how, given that he was a post-surgical patient who was technically still supposed to be on a monitoring protocol. But this seemed to be a consistent feature of Callum Voss rather than an exceptional one. He was in the lobby when she came through, sitting in the same chair he'd been in that afternoon, jacket on, watching the camera crew pack up their equipment. The news unit had gotten their footage, their statement from Mace, their B-roll of the building. They'd also, Hatch told her, obtained the security footage from the corridor. The slap, the badge handover, all of it. The segment was going to run in the morning. Voss looked at her when she passed. "Get some sleep," he said. "That's the plan." Not a question. He held her gaze for a moment. "You look like you're still running the calculations." "I'm always running the calculations." "I know." Something in his voice. "That's what kept us alive, but you can put it down for 6 hours. She looked at him. There was something she wanted to ask. Something about the forward base, about whether he knew, about whether the call he'd made that afternoon had been about more than Farrell and the assault and the care denial file. Whether it had been about this too, the older thing, the thing that had been sitting in a classified folder for 4 years. She didn't ask. Not tonight. "Thank you," she said, "for moving." He looked at her for a moment with those steady dark eyes. "You kept 11 men alive in a drainage ditch in the dark, with 3 units of blood and a trauma kit," he said. "The least I could do was dial a phone." She went home. The shift logs took 40 minutes to upload, which was 40 minutes of sitting at her kitchen table in the dark with her laptop open, watching the progress bar move, thinking about the 63-year-old man and the degraded medications and the man in the loading dock photograph, and a drainage ditch she had not let herself think about in 4 years. She slept for 4 hours, not 3. She would take the extra hour. She was back at Callaway Memorial by 6:15 the next morning. The building was different in the early light. Something had changed in the way the staff moved through it. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who didn't know what the before looked like. But Mara knew what the before looked like, and she could feel the difference. The weight that a building carries when the wrong person has authority over it, the particular quality of self-censorship and managed fear, was not gone, exactly, but it had loosened, like a knot that someone has finally gotten their fingers into. The news segment had run at 6. She hadn't watched it, but she knew it had run because the parking lot had 2 news vehicles in it when she arrived, and the lobby desk attendant looked at her with the slightly stunned expression of someone who has just connected the person walking through the door with the footage they watched over breakfast. Harriet Mace was already in the building. She found Mara in the corridor outside the ER before Mara had made it to the floor. Harriet Mace was 57, small, with silver-streaked hair and the particular quality of attention of someone who has been running large organizations long enough to separate the signal from the noise without effort. She looked at Mara with assessment and not warmth, which Mara found more trustworthy than warmth would have been. "I watched the segment," Mace said. "I've also spent the last 2 hours on calls with the board and with our attorneys." She didn't stop walking, which meant Mara had to walk beside her, which was probably deliberate. "I want to tell you directly. The board's position is that your termination yesterday was unauthorized, procedurally defective, and enacted without board knowledge or approval." That's a careful way of saying it. "It's the accurate way." Mace glanced at her. "I'm not here to perform an apology that substitutes for action. I'm here to tell you that your clinical privileges at this facility are reinstated, effective this morning, and that HR will have formal documentation to you by noon." "And Farrell?" "Suspended without pay, pending investigation. The board voted at 10:30 last night." She paused. "There will be further actions. I don't want to characterize the timeline yet." "His access to the building?" "Revoked." Mara absorbed that. "There are patients in this ER who are affected by his decisions, not just the redirected ones. Current patients, ongoing cases where I believe care decisions were influenced by cost management rather than clinical need. I have observations on several of them. Document everything. Give it to Dr. Anand. I've asked her to serve as interim clinical lead while we stabilize the department." Mace stopped walking. They were at the entrance to the ER. I want you to know that I am aware this building failed you yesterday, in multiple ways, over a significant period of time. She said it without softening and without excessive formality. Just the shape of it. That's a different conversation from the legal one, but I didn't want to table it entirely. Mara looked at her. Thank you. Mace nodded once and went back the way she'd come. Mara went to work. Not in a ceremonial sense. Not because it was the symbolic thing to do or because it made a point. Because there were patients in the ER and there was a charge nurse running short-handed, and the morning shift was always the hardest to staff, and she had been doing this for 7 years and she knew where everything was and how it ran. She picked up the census at the station, took 3 patients from the overnight nurse who looked like he'd been awake for 20 hours, checked on Ruth Alarcon, who had been admitted to the respiratory floor the previous evening after Dr. Anand's consult and was now on an adjusted medication protocol that Mara would have put her on herself if she'd been there for the first conversation. Ruth's oxygen sat was 95. Better. She was in Bay 6 doing a wound reassessment on a construction worker with a hand laceration when her phone buzzed. Delray. She finished taping the dressing, told the patient to keep it dry, and went to the corridor. We executed the warrant this morning, Delray said without preamble. Pruitt's office and the contractor's registered address. We're still on site. What did you find? What we expected, and more than we expected. A pause, and she could hear behind his voice the specific quality of organized chaos, people moving, equipment, voices. The financial structure is what we projected. But there's a secondary communications record, encrypted, but our forensic unit is already into it. Early reads suggest Pruitt was actively monitoring the IG inquiry into the forward base audit. More than monitoring, he had a contact inside the inquiry. Mara was very still in the corridor. Inside the IG's office, she said, inside the review panel of the comms. Not a senior position, not someone with full access, but enough to know when the inquiry was deprioritized and when the classified field reports were pulled for review. Delray's voice was careful. We believe he knew your report existed within 6 months of it being filed. He's been tracking your location since 2021. She pressed her hand flat against the wall. He knew I was in Drenthe, she said. We believe so. We don't yet know whether Farrell's appointment here was connected to your presence or whether that was coincidental. We're working that question now. But it's a question you're working. Yes. There was a silence. Mara looked at the corridor, the morning ER, the nurses moving between bays, a paramedic team at the far end, Sandra at her desk looking up and then looking away, and felt, with a very specific clarity, the difference between a situation that was over and a situation that had just shown her its actual size. What do I need to do? She said. Stay where you are. Don't go anywhere alone today. We're posting a federal presence at the facility while the warrant is active. A pause. And Weston, the contact inside the review panel. We have a name. We're moving on it this morning. He hesitated. I want to prepare you for the possibility that when this is fully public, it is going to be a large story, larger than yesterday's segment. I understand. I'm not sure you do. You're going to be asked to testify, publicly, about the forward base findings, about the audit, about the field report you filed. The classified designation on that material is almost certainly going to be lifted as part of the prosecution. His voice was precise. Everything you documented in 2019 is going to become part of the public record. She looked at the ceiling, at the ordinary fluorescent lights. Okay, she said. Okay. It happened, she said. I documented it because it happened. If that needs to be public, then it needs to be public. Delray was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, there was something in his voice that was not quite personal, but was something adjacent. Thank you, Ms. Weston. We'll be in touch. Hotel. The morning moved as way mornings in an ER move, with the specific relentlessness of a thing that doesn't care about what else is happening. A possible stroke in Bay 1 that turned out to be a severe migraine. An asthma case in Bay 3 that was worse than it presented. A 19-year-old with a broken wrist who was very brave about it and then cried when his mother arrived, which was the most normal thing that happened all morning. Mara worked through all of it. At 9:40, the federal agents arrived in the lobby. Two of them, plain clothes, badges clipped to their belts, the particular bearing that reads law enforcement before anything else. Clarence, who had come in for the day shift, watched them check in at the desk and then looked at Mara across the floor and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. At 10:15, Douglas Farrell's attorney, not Garrett Wolfe, a different man, someone who had presumably been retained in the past 16 hours specifically for this, arrived at the hospital and spent 40 minutes with Harriet Mace and the board's legal counsel in the administrative conference room. Mara didn't know what was said in that meeting. What she knew was that when the attorney left, he looked like a man who had walked in expecting leverage and walked out carrying only the bill for his time. At 11:30, the Drenthe Register ran an online piece. It pulled from the morning news segment, the board statement, and two sources it described as hospital staff speaking on condition of anonymity. It named Farrell. It described the care denial pattern, the financial investigation, the assault. It did not yet have the Pruitt connection or the forward-based thread because Delray was holding those until the warrant work was complete, but it had enough. By noon, the piece had several thousand shares. Mara saw it on Sandra's phone screen when Sandra came to find her in Bay 4. "People are calling," Sandra said. "Former patients. The desk has had 8 calls since 9. People saying they were turned away from this ER. People saying they told their story to someone 6 months ago and nobody followed up." Sandra's voice had a quality it hadn't had before. Not guilt, exactly, but the immediate practical engagement of someone who has decided to stop managing their guilt and start doing something instead. "I think there should be someone collecting those calls. Someone who knows what to do with that information." "Tell Mace," Mara said. "She should set up a formal intake process today. Those calls need to go to Delray's office, not into a phone log." Sandra nodded and went. At 12:40, Hatch appeared in the ER, not in his uniform, in civilian clothes, which meant he was here personally rather than officially. He found Mara at the nursing station and stood beside her, watching the floor. "Pruitt's been taken in," he said quietly, "an hour ago. His attorney was already at the U.S. Attorney's office when the warrant team was still on site, which tells you how fast he had people moving." He paused. "They found the communications record. The contact inside the review panel has been identified and suspended pending investigation." "Who was it?" "A civilian analyst, mid-level, been with the IG's office for 9 years. He said it flatly. "For what it's worth, Farlow says he didn't have access to the full content of your report, only the metadata, that it existed, who filed it, when. That was enough for Pruitt to track me." "For 4 years, yes." He looked at her sideways. "For what it's worth, we don't believe Farrell's placement here was about you. We think it was about the billing infrastructure. This facility was a good target on its own merits. The fact that you were here was probably convenient," she said, "or irrelevant to him until the billing investigation started and he went looking for anything that could complicate it." Mara thought about that, about the specific cold logic of it, a scheme operating in the background, invisible, and her notes sitting on her laptop at home, and Pruitt's contact in the review panel, and all of it converging in this building on a rainy afternoon because an old man had been standing in a parking lot. "Callum knew more than he told me," she said. Hatch was quiet for a moment. "Voss has been retired for 6 years. He does not technically have access to federal procurement watch list data." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "He knew the billing pattern connected to something older. He didn't know the full shape of it. He made some calls before he came here yesterday, and some of what he got back was," Hatch chose his words, "directional. And he came anyway." He came anyway. Mara looked at the ER floor. At the motion of it, the persistent ordinary emergency of it. Bay 1, Bay 2, Bay 3. A nurse pushing a med cart. An orderly with a wheelchair. The desk phone ringing. The doors opening and closing. "I'm going to need an attorney," she said. "You said that last night. I mean a specific kind. Someone who does federal testimony prep." "I have a name." "Of course you do." She picked up the chart she'd set down. "I'm going to finish my shift." Hatch looked at her. "You've been here since 6:15. "The charge nurse is short." He said nothing for a moment, then, "I'll be in the building." She went back to the floor.
At 2:10 in the afternoon, Dr. Priya Anand pulled Mara into the break room and closed the door with the expression of someone delivering news they are still processing themselves. The board just voted on the directorship, Anand said. Farrell is terminated. Formal separation, not suspension. Effective today. She looked at Mara. Mace is serving as acting director until a search committee convenes. Good. There's more. Anand sat down, which was unusual for her. Mace asked me to communicate something to you directly. The board has authorized a formal review of every patient discharge from this ER over the past 18 months. Every case where a redirect, a referral out, or an against medical advice discharge is documented. Every case. She looked up. She wants you to lead the clinical portion of the review. Mara looked at her. I'm a staff nurse. You have clinical training that exceeds most of the attendings in this department and a documented observation record spanning 7 years. Anand's voice was matter-of-fact. And you have been watching this pattern longer than anyone else in this building. She paused. Mace said, and this is a direct quote, that she was not interested in optics, she was interested in accuracy, and accuracy required the person who had actually been paying attention. There was a silence in the break room. There will be more than 11 cases, Mara said. I know. Some of them will have outcomes that are going to be very hard to read. I know that too. Mara sat down across from Anand. The break room was small and slightly overlit and smelled like burnt coffee, and it was the same break room she had eaten lunch in hundreds of times in 7 years. And it was also, in some ways she couldn't fully articulate, a different room now. Yes, she said. Yes to the review? Yes. Anand nodded once, the way certain people nod when they've gotten the answer they expected and are already moving to the next thing. I also need you to know, Anand said, and her voice shifted slightly, became less administrative, that I was in that lobby yesterday. When it happened. She looked at Mara directly. I said something after. I should have said something before. You said something, Mara said. It was too late. But you said it. She looked at Anand. Most people didn't. There was a pause. That's a low bar, Anand said. Most bars are lower than they should be, Mara said. That doesn't mean clearing them doesn't count. Anand left. Mara sat in the break room for 3 minutes. She drank what was left of a coffee that had been sitting on the counter long enough to be cold because old habits, and thought about the review. 18 months of discharges. 11 documented cases in her logs, but she had let herself half know, that 11 was a floor, not a ceiling. The cases she had documented were the ones with enough irregularity to flag, enough observable wrongness to write down. There would be others, cases that had been wrong in quieter ways, wrong under the surface, wrong in the gap between what the paperwork said and what the patient had actually experienced. There would be names. People who had come to this building and been failed, and she was going to have to look at each one. She was not looking forward to it. She was going to do it anyway, with the same precision and the same refusal to look away that she had brought to a drainage ditch in the dark, and to 7 years of morning shifts, and to a rainy parking lot the previous afternoon. She got up, rinsed the coffee cup, went back to the floor. At 3:50, her phone buzzed with a text from Delray's number. Farrell just requested a proffer meeting. His attorney called 20 minutes ago. She read it twice. A proffer meeting meant Farrell was ready to talk. Meant his attorney had looked at the forensic record from Pruitt's office and the communications intercepts and the billing documentation and whatever else Delray's team had assembled and had told his client with the flat honesty that criminal defense attorneys reserve for moments when continuing to fight is actively destructive, that the question was no longer whether this was over, but how badly it ended. She put the phone back in her pocket. At 4:30, when her shift was technically over and she was still at the station finishing documentation because there was no one to hand it to yet, Sandra came to find her again. There's someone at the desk, Sandra said. She's been waiting for 40 minutes. She says she was redirected from this ER last year. She says she has her discharge paperwork. Sandra's voice was careful. She says she tried to report it before and nothing happened. Mara looked up from the chart. Her name? Daria Tesaro, Sandra said. Mara set down the chart.
Tesoro. She knew that name from Del Rey's file, from Farlow's call, from the shape of an account she had been given but not yet made fully real in her mind. Armand Tesoro, 63, sent home with antacids, dead 14 hours later. This was his daughter, the one who had filed the complaint that went nowhere, who had tried to report it before and nothing had happened, who had been waiting 40 minutes at the front desk of the hospital that had killed her father with her discharge paperwork in her hands. Mara took a breath. She went to the desk. Daria Tesoro was around 40, with dark circles under her eyes, and the particular composure of someone who has been holding themselves together by force of will for a long time, and is not sure how much longer they can do it. She was holding a folder of papers against her chest with both hands. She looked at Mara. "Are you... Someone told me you were the nurse who..." "I'm Mara Weston," Mara said. "Let's go somewhere we can sit down." She took Daria Tesoro to the consultation room, the same room where she had sat with Voss and Hatch the night before, the same box of tissues on the windowsill. And she sat across from her and she listened, with the full and specific attention of someone who had learned a very long time ago that listening was not passive, that it was the first clinical act, the foundational one, the one that everything else depended on. Daria talked for 20 minutes. The paperwork, the complaint, the medical board, the walls, the phone calls that didn't get returned. Her father's face when he'd left this ER that night, the way he had died at home because the hospital he'd come to for help had sent him away. Mara listened to all of it. When Daria was done, she sat back and looked at Mara with an expression that was both exhausted and very, very watchful. The expression of someone who has been disappointed so many times by the people who were supposed to help that hope itself had become a liability. "What happens now?" Daria said. Mara looked at her. "Now, your father's case is going to be part of a federal investigation. His discharge paperwork is going to become evidence. The people responsible for what happened to him are going to face consequences. Legal, professional, and public." She said it without hedging and without softening it into something easier. "That doesn't undo what happened. I'm not going to tell you it does." Daria's jaw moved. "But it's real? It's actually happening? It's actually happening." Something broke open in Daria Tesoro's face. Not neatly, not cleanly, the way things break when they've been held closed for a long time. She pressed her hand over her mouth, did not cry, or not quite. The specific near miss of someone who has decided not to cry in front of strangers and is keeping to that decision by a very thin margin. "I told everyone he didn't just die," she said. "I told them something was wrong, for a year." "I know," Mara said. "You were right." They sat in the room for another few minutes. Mara gave Daria the number for Del Rey's office and Farlow's office, and the formal patient intake line that Sandra had set up 2 hours ago. She made sure Daria had them written down, not just in her phone. She walked her out to the lobby. She was standing at the lobby entrance watching Daria's car pull out of the parking lot when Hatch appeared beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. They stood there for a moment, the lobby behind them, the late afternoon parking lot in front, the same parking lot where this had all started 27 hours ago with an old man standing in the rain. "Farrell's proffer meeting is set for tomorrow morning," Hatch said. "Del Rey thinks he'll give up the Pruitt connection and the board relationships in exchange for a sentencing recommendation." "And Pruitt?" "No proffer. His attorney is going full trial." Hatch paused. "That means your testimony. The forward base material. All of it." "I know. It's going to be hard. I know that too." She looked at the parking lot. Hatch, the forward base, the medications, the outcomes that didn't make sense, were real, he said. "We always knew they were real. The investigation just couldn't prove the mechanism." "It will now." "Yes," he said. "It will now." Mara stood in the lobby entrance and let that settle into her. What it meant that the thing she had filed a report on and then carried alone for 4 years was going to become a matter of public record. What it meant that the patients at that base who had had outcomes that didn't make sense were going to have those outcomes acknowledged, documented, explained. What it meant that someone had finally connected all of it, the medications, the billing fraud, the care denials, the loading dock photograph, into a single shape that could be named. She had not connected it herself. She had documented pieces and kept her logs and treated her patients and looked at her shift notes every few months with the nagging sense that the pattern she was seeing was part of something she couldn't see the full dimensions of. It had taken Callum Voss in a rainstorm and a man who hit a nurse in a hospital hallway. She turned back inside. She went to the ER. She picked up the chart she'd set down when Sandra came to find her. She was finishing the last of the documentation when the charge nurse appeared at the station and said, with the flat exhaustion of a person who has been on shift for 10 hours, "Tell me you're staying for the back half." Mara picked up the next chart. "I'm here," she said. She had just opened the chart when her phone buzzed. Not a call, a text. From the number Delray had been using. She looked at it. Pruitt's attorney just filed a motion to suppress the classified audit file. Grounds: improper chain of custody in the 2019 review. If it holds, the forward base evidence is out. We need you in my office at 7 a.m. Bring everything. She read it twice. 3 times. The suppression motion. If Pruitt's attorney could get the audit file excluded, the entire thread connecting the hospital scheme to the military supply chain fraud collapsed. The billing case would stand, but the larger story, the mechanism, the forward base, Armin Tessaro's name sitting alongside those of soldiers who had been harmed by degraded medications in a country Mara still didn't say out loud, that would disappear back into a folder marked classified and insufficient evidence. Pruitt's attorney had filed the motion at 5:17 in the afternoon, 2 minutes ago. Mara looked at the ER around her, at the lights and the beds and the nurses moving and the doors opening, at the place she had come to 4 years ago to build something quieter and found instead, today, that quiet and gone were not the same thing, and that the things you document because they happened do not stay in the past simply because you have moved on from them. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the chart in her hands. And across the ER, through the bay window of Bay 3, she saw something that pulled her attention with the specific force of clinical instinct. A patient, mid-60s, who had been admitted 40 minutes ago for what was documented as stable chest discomfort, and who was now sitting up in his bed with a posture and a color that did not match stable, that matched something that needed to be looked at right now, before the monitor alarmed, before anyone else saw it. She was moving before she finished the thought. The chart could wait. The motion could wait. 7 a.m. could wait. Right now there was a patient in Bay 3 and she was the one who had seen it. She pushed through the curtain. The man in Bay 3 was named Gerald Okafor, 61, admitted with what the intake notes described as intermittent chest tightness and a history of hypertension. His attending had ordered a troponin panel and an EKG and documented him as stable for monitoring. On paper, he was fine. He was not fine. Mara saw it in the set of his shoulders before she saw anything the monitor could tell her. The forward lean, the jaw tight in a specific way, the shallow breathing of a man whose body was working harder than it should to do something that should have been automatic. She had seen this exact posture in places where there was no monitor and no EKG and no troponin panel, where the only diagnostic tool available was the ability to read a human body under stress and act on what you read. She pulled the curtain, checked his pressure manually, looked at his color, his nail beds, the small involuntary movements of his face. "Mr. Okafor, tell me what's happening right now." "Same as before," he said, but his jaw was tight saying it. "Pressure in the chest." "When did it change?" A pause. 10 minutes ago, maybe 15. "Did you press the call button?" He looked at her, and in his expression was the thing she had seen in waiting rooms and in parking lots and in the faces of people from certain zip codes in this city. The particular hesitation of someone who has been taught, by accumulated experience, that asking for more than they were already getting was likely to cost them something. "Didn't want to bother anyone," he said. She pressed the call button herself. She was already at the crash cart when the monitor alarmed 30 seconds later, the ST elevation rolling across the screen with the flat clinical certainty of a thing that had been coming and had now arrived. What followed was not elegant. It was fast and loud and slightly disorganized in the way that genuine emergencies always are. The attending arriving at a run, the respiratory tech 2 minutes out, the defibrillator paddles coming out of the cart and going back in when his rhythm held, The medication sequence that Mara called out from memory and the attending confirmed without looking up because there was no time to look up. Gerald Okafor's wife arrived in the waiting room during the middle of it, having been called from the parking lot where she'd gone to move the car, and Sandra intercepted her before she reached the bay. 40 minutes later, Gerald Okafor was on his way to the cath lab with a stabilized rhythm and an IV, and the particular gray-faced calm of a man who understands he came very close to something and is not yet sure how to hold that. His wife was in the corridor. She grabbed Mara's arm as she came out of the bay. He's stable. He's going to the cath lab now. They're going to find what needs to be fixed and fix it. Mara looked at her directly. He's in the right place. The woman's face did something that was not quite relief. Not yet, because relief requires the absence of fear, and the fear was still very present. But something in it shifted. She pressed Mara's arm once and let go. Mara went back to the station. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady, even when everything else wasn't. It was one of the first things she'd noticed about herself in the early days of her service, that her hands had a kind of mechanical loyalty to the task, regardless of what the rest of her was doing. She was glad for it now. She finished her documentation. She went home at 8:15 out. The suppression motion failed. Delray called her at 6:40 the next morning while she was still in the car to tell her that the judge had reviewed the chain of custody argument overnight and denied it. The classified audit file, and with it the field reports, would remain part of the evidentiary record. The hearing had taken 35 minutes. Pruitt's attorney had argued carefully and at length, and the judge had listened carefully and at length, and then had said no. "We're moving to trial prep," Delray said. "Your testimony will be in approximately 6 weeks. We'll have multiple prep sessions before then." "Understood." "Weston," a pause. "You held the line on that report for 4 years. I want you to know it mattered." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. He hung up. She sat in the parking lot of Callaway Memorial for a moment. The building in the early light. The same building she had been thrown out of 4 days ago and had come back to the next morning because there was nowhere else to be and nothing else she knew how to do. She went inside. The weeks that followed were not triumphant. They were complicated and exhausting and occasionally infuriating, which is what real accountability looks like when it's happening rather than after it's been written up. Farrell's proffer meeting produced what Delray had projected. He gave up the board relationships, identified the 2 Drenthi board members who had facilitated Pruitt's access, and confirmed the financial arrangement in enough detail to close the gap in the billing case. In exchange, his attorney negotiated a sentencing recommendation. He would still face federal charges. He would still lose his medical administration license. The recommendation reduced the ceiling, but did not eliminate the floor. It was not the outcome that felt satisfying. It was the outcome that would hold. Pruitt went to trial 7 weeks later. The classified material came in. Mara testified for 4 hours on a Tuesday morning in a federal courtroom in Drenthe, in front of a gallery that included 3 journalists, 2 retired military officers, a representative from the state medical board, and Daria Tesaro, who sat in the second row and did not look away for the entire 4 hours. Mara described what she had seen at the forward base in 2019. She described the patients whose outcomes she had documented, the irregularities she had recorded, the report she had filed. She described it in the same flat, precise language she had used in the report itself, because that language was the most accurate container for those events, and accuracy was what she owed to the people involved. She did not perform it. She did not make it smaller than it was. She answered every question fully, and she did not embellish, and she did not flinch. When Pruitt's attorney cross-examined her, he tried 3 different angles to suggest her documentation was incomplete, her memory unreliable, her clinical conclusions overreaching. She answered each one with the same quality of attention. Not defensive, not combative, just accurate, the way a person is accurate when they were there, and they know what they saw, and they wrote it down at the time. By the 3rd angle, the attorney had moved on. Pruitt was convicted on 11 counts, including federal procurement fraud, conspiracy, and 3 counts of reckless endangerment connected to the degraded medical supply chain. The sentencing hearing set a date 8 weeks out. His attorney announced an intent to appeal, which everyone expected and which the evidentiary record would make difficult. Farrell was formally charged 2 weeks after the proffer meeting. He pled guilty to 7 counts at a hearing that lasted 40 minutes and generated a news segment that ran for 3 minutes and felt, to most people in the room, simultaneously enormous and insufficient. He was sentenced to 4 years with eligibility for parole at 2.5, stripped of all professional certifications, and ordered to repay a financial amount that ran to 7 figures. The 2 board members who had facilitated Pruitt's access resigned before charges were filed and then were charged anyway. None of it was clean. None of it was complete in the way that resolution is supposed to feel, the way justice looks in the stories where it arrives on time and covers everything. Some of the patients who had been harmed could not be reached. Some of the harm could not be undone or fully documented. Armand Tesaro was still dead. The man at the forward base, whose outcome had first made Mara write a report, was still whatever he was now, somewhere, carrying whatever he carried. Those things did not resolve. They were carried. But Daria Tesaro sat in a federal courtroom and heard her father's case become part of a public record. She sat there, and she heard a nurse describe, in a clear and accurate voice, what her father had experienced and why, and what should have happened instead. And when it was over, she found Mara in the corridor outside and looked at her for a moment without saying anything, and then said, "He would have wanted to know someone saw it." "Someone saw it," Mara said. The hospital review took 11 weeks. Mara led the clinical portion alongside Dr. Anand and an external auditor from the State Medical Board. They reviewed 22 months of ER discharge records. They found 37 cases with irregularities significant enough to require further investigation. Of those, 14 involved care decisions that the review panel classified as clinically unjustifiable by any reasonable standard. 6 of those 14 patients or their families were contacted and offered case reviews, formal apologies from the hospital board, and referrals to legal counsel. Not all of them wanted legal counsel. Some wanted the apology. Some wanted neither. They wanted the acknowledgement, the simple official fact of someone from the institution looking at what had happened and saying, out loud, this was wrong. Harriet Mace made those calls herself. All 6. Mara knew this because Mace told her without being asked, which was the kind of accounting that you notice because it didn't have to happen, and did anyway. The hospital implemented new intake protocols, a direct patient advocacy line, and a peer review structure for discharge decisions in the emergency department. The changes were not revolutionary, and they were not enough on their own, and everyone involved in drafting them knew this. But they were documented, they were binding, and they were real. In the 8th week after the trial, Hatch called. Not about the case. The case had its own momentum now, its own calendar of hearings and appeals and administrative proceedings that would continue for longer than anyone wanted to think about. He called about something else. Joint Medical Command is standing up a civilian military trauma training program, he said. There's a coordination slot, someone to bridge the clinical and tactical training components, work with both civilian emergency teams and military medical personnel. A pause. They asked me for names. Mara was in the break room, cold coffee, old habit. What does the slot look like? She said. 18 months initially, travel, real work, not ceremonial. Another pause. You'd keep your nursing credentials current. You'd also be in rooms where the things you documented, the patterns you found, the things you know how to see, that knowledge would actually get built into how people are trained. She looked at the break room wall, the same slightly overlit room, the same coffee smell. I'm in the middle of the review, she said. The review is 3 weeks from completion. I have patience. Every nurse has patience. That's not what I'm asking. She knew it wasn't. She looked at her hands around the coffee cup, the thin scar across her left palm from the gurney rail, barely visible now, the kind of thing that fades to a line and stays there. Give me a week, she said. You have 2 days, he said. I know you. A week, and you'll talk yourself out of it. She almost laughed. 2 days. Thank you. He hung up before she could change her answer, which was probably also deliberate. She told Voss in person. He was in Drenthe for the sentencing hearing. He had been in and out of the city for months, apparently, which she had only recently stopped being surprised by. And she found him in the hospital cafeteria of all places, eating a bowl of soup with the focused efficiency of someone who eats to function rather than for pleasure. She sat across from him and told him about the training program. He listened, finished his soup, set the spoon down. "You're going to say yes," he said. "I said yes this morning." "I know, I'm just noting that you said it like you're still deciding." He looked at her. "You're not still deciding." "No," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The 11 men you kept alive. You know that number doesn't stop at 11. "I know." "The people who are alive because of those 11. The kids. The people who would have come undone if those 11 hadn't come home." He said it without sentiment, just the arithmetic of it. "That number is larger than you're going to be able to count. And the program, the training, that number keeps going. You're in the chain." She looked at him, the quiet ex-soldier with his sutured forearm and his bowl of soup and his years of watching and his one phone call that had broken something loose. "Why did you come here?" she said. "The day you came. The real reason." He was quiet for a moment. "I was looking for someone who still moved," he said. "When things go wrong, most people freeze. They wait for permission. They wait for someone else to go first. They've been trained by institutions, by fear, by the specific lesson that moving is what gets you in trouble." He looked at her steadily. "I needed to know this department had someone who didn't wait, because I was about to pull a thread that was going to make things very bad for the people in this building, and I needed to know there was someone here who could hold the floor while it happened." Mara sat with that. "You used me," she said. Not accusation, just naming it. "I gave you a reason to be seen," he said. "Those are different things." She thought about that, about the distinction between being used and being given a stage, about whether the difference mattered when the outcome was the same. She thought about 12 people in a hallway and the weight of their silence, and she thought about Daria Tesaro in the second row of a courtroom, and she thought about Gerald Okafor's wife letting go of her arm. "Yeah," she said finally. "They are." She worked her last shift at Callaway Memorial on a Friday morning. Not dramatically. She did not make a speech. She cleared her locker, updated her pending documentation, made sure the charge nurse had everything she needed, and said goodbye to the people worth saying goodbye to. Sandra stopped her at the desk. "I'm going to tell you something," Sandra said. "And I know it's too late, and you know it's too late. So I'm not asking you to receive it as anything other than the truth." She looked at Mara directly. "I knew something was wrong in this department for a long time. I kept calling it something else because it was easier." Her jaw was tight. "I watched you get hit in front of me and I didn't move." "Sandra, let me finish." Her voice was controlled, but only just. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my career being that person. I'm telling you because I want you to know the reason I'm not going to be that person is because of what you did." A pause. "Not because of the federal case, not because it ended the way it did, because you went back to work the next morning and you led that review and you looked at every one of those cases and you didn't let anyone look away." Mara looked at her for a moment. "You moved today," she said. "That counts. It's a low bar. It's where you are. Clear it and then find the next one." She picked up her bag. "You're a good intake coordinator, Sandra. Be a better one." Sandra pressed her lips together, nodded. Mara walked out. The parking lot looked the same as it always had. The same asphalt, the same lines, the same entrance where she had stood in the rain holding an old man's arm. The morning light made it ordinary, and it was ordinary. It was just a parking lot. She stood there for a moment. She thought about who she had been when she'd arrived here 4 years ago. Tired in a specific way, the way you are tired after you've been the kind of person a situation required, and then the situation ends and you find out that the ordinary world has no particular use for that kind of person. She had come to Drenthe to rest. She had not known that rest was not the same as disappearing, that the things she knew how to do didn't stop being true simply because she was trying not to deploy them. She had saved 11 people in a drainage ditch in the dark, and then spent 4 years saving people under fluorescent lights and eating cold coffee, and neither version of that was less real than the other. She had been seen,
finally, not because she had revealed herself, but because the situation had become one that could not be managed from the edges, and she had done what she always did. She had moved.
The thing she had learned, standing in that parking lot in the ordinary morning, was not that she was exceptional. She had known that about herself in a flat, empirical way since she was 23 years old, and it had never made her feel the way the stories about exceptional people are supposed to feel. What she had learned was this: the people who run the rooms, the ones who decide which patients get care and which ones get redirected, the ones who slap nurses in hallways and count on silence to cover it, they count on you to stay at the edges. They build systems designed to make the edges feel like the natural place to be. And the most dangerous thing you can do, the thing that costs them everything, is simply refuse to stay there. Not loudly, not with a speech, just by moving when something needs to be done. She got in her car. She had a flight in 3 hours. A debrief in a federal building in a city she had been to before, under different circumstances. And then, after that, the first session with the training program coordinators. The first meeting in a series of meetings where she would be in a room of people learning how to do the things she had spent her adult life doing, and she would teach them. Not how to be exceptional, not how to be fearless, but how to be accurate, how to be present, how to move when the moment required it. She drove out of the parking lot. She did not look back. Not because it wasn't worth looking at, it was all of it, the patients and the review and Daria Tesaro in the second row, and Gerald Okafor's wife and Sandra at the desk with her clipboard and her decision to clear the next bar. All of it was worth looking at. But the road was forward, and she knew how to drive it, and there were people ahead of her who had not yet learned what she had learned. That the most powerful thing you can be in a room that has decided to look away is the one who does not. She had always known how to be that. She just hadn't let it be seen. Now it was